Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Brenda Jimenez. I'm CEO of Mentor New York, and it is my honor to facilitate and host this conversation today. So just to begin, I know there's going to be a lot of folks on the call, so I just wanted to let you know we are recording this session, and you will receive the recording soon after in case you want to share with your staff or other individuals. You will see that you have a question in a chat box in sort of the menu on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have questions or have a comment or something, please make sure to type it in. You will be in mute for most of the session, and then we'll open it up for questions towards the end. For Mentor New York, this is a new platform. We usually have very formal webinars, but I usually have the pleasure of talking to amazing professionals in their own right and expertise in their fields. And I sort of thought, you know, we should have this conversation somewhere where people are witnessing it so we could share the wealth of information. So that's what we're going to try to do today. If you don't like the format, please provide us feedback. But for now, this is what we're going to attempt to do in sort of this new virtual reality we have before us. So today we really want to talk about sort of how do we start nurturing the mental health of our young people. I think that's something that's always been close and dear to my work as I do the work here for Mentor New York and the mentoring movement across the state, but most especially now post this global pandemic, the reality that our young people are not doing well, and there's a lot of things that are affecting their realities, and how as adults, when we ourselves are challenged and struggling with all the same sort of realities, to provide the supports that they need. So what I'm going to do now is introduce you to our panelists and our guests, who I'm very blessed to know for many, many years, and Mariel, who's a new friend, who I'm super blessed to know now. So first, Dr. Roshnee Vasquez Barrett. She is a bilingual Puerto Rican psychologist licensed in New York and New Jersey, and has extensive training and experience in delivering culturally responsive treatment and interventions. She's worked in New York City hospital centers and private practice settings, and her clinical work has focused on mental health needs of the Latinx Spanish-speaking community, people of color, LGBTQ community, and individuals struggling with substance misuse. She's been an adjunct professor at Hudson Community College, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and Fairleigh Dickinson University. And she's currently working at the Motherhood Center of New York, providing care to pre- and postpartum mothers, addressing a wide variety of issues related to motherhood and parenting. So I thought she was very well positioned to have this conversation today. And super, super honored that she's here. Rashi and I know each other for almost over 20 years, so it's always an honor to have her in my space. Dr. Mariel Buqué is an Afro-Dominican counseling psychologist and educator. She provides clinical care and teaches courses in the areas of culturally responsive delivery of mental health care and the decolonization of Eurocentric therapeutic practices. Her clinical work focuses on healing wounds of intergenerational trauma for Black and Indigenous people of color. She also focuses on delivering racial healing workshops and conducting mental health and anti-racism workshops across the areas of structural racism, cultural competency, implicit bias, microaggressions as well. So welcome, Dr. Buqué. Thank you. So I thought it was I was very intentional as to who I put on the panel. It has been extremely clear that part of what's happened with this pandemic of COVID-19 across this country is that the racial disparities and inequities have come to full light, right? There is no hiding it anymore. And within that, all those cultural realities of what happens in communities get very, very real. And so I think when I'm looking at today's discussion, I want to take it through sort of these three realities, right? As adults walking into this space, what can we be doing right? And what can we start doing to help our young people so that they can start to put their arms around their emotions and their feelings and get some language around it. So if we could accomplish having those conversations today and helping guide folks, I think that that would be my sort of mission for the day. So I guess I'll start with, we're in the mentoring space or in youth development space, and when we're working with adults, we always say, you got to start with you first because you show up. You're an essential part of that relationship. So let's start with sort of what folks as adults are going through and what they need to start putting their arms around. So I guess my first question is going to be huge, right? How do we deal as adults? I mean, it's a lot. Virtual working, virtual school, economics, every challenge you had before magnified, stress and anxiety. I mean, every parent, non-parent, everyone in the adult stratosphere is feeling it, right? So how do we deal? What's the advice?
So I'll jump in. So I think, and this may sound like very basic, right? But I think there has to be an acknowledgement that this is going on and that what is going on is impacting us in different ways, in different forms day to day. But there is something about like what we're experiencing now in our society is unprecedented. This is not something that we have ever sort of prepared or thought of. So step one is, yeah, like acknowledging and accepting this is what's going on. And like taking a look at ourselves to really ask ourselves, am I okay? Right? How am I feeling? Am I okay? And be okay with the idea of if I'm not okay, then let me figure out ways to take care of myself, right? Which, I'm a therapist, so certainly one way is like therapy, but there's so many other ways, right? We can like reach out to family, we can reach out to like people that we respect, if we're connected with, sort of clergy or spiritual figures. I mean, there's people that we can sort of reach out to get support, and to help kind of get our thoughts together. So that's sort of, for me, I think the first step is like, this is going on. This is affecting all of us. This is affecting me in some way. Is it like, what is that way? And figure out, I'm not okay in this regard, or I need to talk to someone. That I think is sort of like a first step.
Yeah. Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I mean, I think, it's critical that we, as the adults in this stratosphere of this pandemic, really have an understanding of what is happening to all of us, right? That we really call it what it is, which is a collective trauma. We're in collective crisis, and that means that right now, just like, Dr. Vasquez Barrett mentioned, like what we're experiencing is unprecedented. It's something that came and just, shocked the world. And that experience of shock, of denial, of grief, numbness, aloneness, like a lot of those experiences, those emotional experiences and visceral experiences that are happening within us are part of what that autonomic nervous system kind of expression of crisis, right? Of this ginormous threat that is happening within our world. And when you compound that with the more vulnerable identities out there being impacted by COVID-19, then you have, even more of an impact, even more of a crisis that's hitting home. So one thing that I can think of is just understanding that right now is a moment of survival, right? Like I think there is a general narrative out there where we're like trying to fix and problem solve and, what do we do? And like, let's get to work. And there's a lot of that. And that can be a very natural reaction to something that makes us feel out of control. However, it's important to, instead of activating that piece at 100, that we activate the piece that is self-preserving and make sure that we're taking care of our very basic selves, our basic emotional needs, especially as we remain vulnerable through what seems to be like a couple more weeks or months to come. Who knows?
Yeah, and I think that for a lot of us, and we've had this conversation, when you're a caretaker, especially when you're talking about the youth development field, people who volunteer that are very giving of themselves, and they find themselves to be strong people, and they kind of like plummet through hardships. It becomes really important to say pause and listen to what you're saying, Roshni, to am I feeling this? And even the physical reality, right? The panic attacks, the anxiety attacks that are increasing, and not ignoring that your body and your mind need some care from you, right?
Yeah, and I think, particularly for people who are, really resilient and like, sort of like survive and like push through and, really want to do something and are really motivated by like helping others and giving, those are the folks that often need to take, almost like more care of themselves, right? Because they can often sort of either neglect or just like not sort of see it, right? Because they're really motivated to sort of give and think outward. And so, but it's sort of similar, right? Like, I mean, when we're on the airplane, right, the announcement is like, put the mask on you before you go and like help someone else, right? So in some ways, that we have to sort of do that. And that's certainly, and there's something about like, and acknowledging like, yeah, I don't know if I'm okay, kind of normalizing that a little bit now, right? Because again, like these times are not, right? It's like these aren't normal times, right? And so if I'm nervous about if I'm going to have my job, if I know someone who's getting ill, if there's so many things coming up that as strong as we are and want to be, like we're still humans, we're not robots. And so having an emotional experience is like part of being a human, and I think then puts us then in a better position to really then be able to understand where someone else is coming from, right? There's something about normalizing like emotions. And yeah, normalizing the emotions and like this thinking about it as collective trauma, like that's what it is, right? And that's not something like, oh, I'm just gonna push through like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I identify that I have this stress because we have it. What do we start doing? Because I think that it's easy to say we're resilient and need more self-care, Um, but I think when you're not used to asking for help and you're not used to articulating your feelings, it's a little harder. So Mariel, Dr. Boca, how do we start even addressing it? What do I do, right?
I mean, I think it starts like, with an understanding of emotionality. I think what many of us, we didn't grow up in a generation. I mean, I think we're trying to change it for the next generation, right? But we didn't grow up in a generation where we, had emotion-based language or lessons embedded in the actual curriculum, right? Like we didn't have that. Like in health class, they taught us about all other things, right? Like health ed was everything but, hey, here's your mental health. And, this is an emotion that you're likely to feel. Even emotions that, prohibit us from actually seeking out care or help, like shame, my being ashamed that I'm actually experiencing some sense of anxiety during this time. Like I'm hyper aroused and I'm irritable and I don't really, know what to do with all of that. And I'm lashing out at this person in my home, and at work, I'm like not attentive and missing the mark on a couple things. And the fact that, all of that is happening as a natural reaction to crisis and to a genuine threat, and not being able to reconcile the fact that that brings about shame, especially when it feels like it's, connected to mental health and mental unwellness, makes it so that people then don't take that added step to then want to maybe engage in conversations about it. Not even like all the way up to seeking care, therapeutic care, which we know there are barriers connected to that as well. So it's not all on the person. However, we can start with basic things that we can do. And I think that there's so much. I mean, like we would need like 20 webinars to probably like go through the full gamut of things that we can do as far as self-care that can actually help us to ground ourselves during this time. Roshnee and I, are both and have been, part of teams that have done very active work in grounding the person through self-soothing methods. And self-soothing could literally be something as simple as like I simply went to my parents' house and did like a no-touch pickup of my mom's asopao, and I knew that that was every bite that I took was gonna just fill my heart and regulate me and regulate all this anxiety in a way that was not happening with all of the other things that I had employed as far as self-care. I knew I needed that mother's touch. I needed to taste Dominican food cooked by my mother in a very specific way, and that was going to be, and I knew that my mom put her heart and soul into that, and that was going to be like what I needed. So self-care can be so many things. It's not the yogas and the this and the, like it's the little things that we can do on a daily basis, even on an hourly basis, to keep ourselves grounded.
Right. It's almost remembering the values and the things that bring you joy, if you know those things, or being able to even embrace self-discovery in this process and discover, oh, I really enjoyed, that 4 minutes of whatever, and then go do it again to the extent that it's healthy for you, right? I think that, you hear all these tips about yoga and whatever. I'm not any of those things. So I'm not going to start getting a mat and going to yoga, right? And I love it,
Right.
I think that it's great for people who do it, but there are things like, even I've gotten into this whole deep breathing thing. I thought it was kind of ridiculous, and I started giggling the first 5 minutes, but 3 days in, it's pretty impressive, right? So it's also being willing to try new things to start to center yourself. I think that that's really important. One of the reasons why I specifically wanted to speak to the both of you, because I think this is an important part of this conversation with young people as we start to go deeper as to how to really have these conversations with them, is the first is around your own self-care, right? And being totally aware of that. And I think that people need to understand that if you're not paying attention to you, you're not going to be effective, to your point, Rob, to anybody else. But there's this other thing too, with all the disparities that we've been seeing happening around the cultural humility that you have to have at this point when you are talking to young people, and when you're talking to other people in general, but definitely to young people that are in very different circumstances than the ones that you may be in, right? And so, what are some of the things that adults have to be aware of going into these conversations with young people so that they don't misstep? Because my assumptions, when I bring them in, can really mess up that conversation. And I inadvertently, through my own exhibiting of microaggressions, can do more harm than good, right? So how do we start to get our arms around sort of that cultural humility that we need to have?
So
Go ahead, Dr. Barrett.
yeah, so I think kind of think about it sort of like in a few steps. I think one is in sort of this idea of cultural humility is sort of understanding that for me to kind of acknowledge that I may have assumptions and about about individuals that are different than I am, that somehow like that makes me a racist, that makes me a this, that makes me a that. And I think people can get, it's uncomfortable. I think it's an uncomfortable sort of thing, like to like examine or to sort of like to even just this idea of like, well, of course I don't go in with any assumptions, right? And it's sort of think kind of like working past that and developing, I think, comfort around the idea that like my experience is, likely different from so and so's, right? And that doesn't, I'm not somehow like at a disadvantage, like I won't be able to like connect with that person, or I care less about them, right? It like means something less about me. But there's something to me being comfortable with that, me being comfortable to like be curious and sort of acknowledge things that I might not know about like that person's circumstance, or like, I'm even thinking, with like how like culturally we may be like responding to things. Like one of the things, that I'm thinking about right now specifically is like even just around like how families may respond to folks that are ill or people who have passed away, and sort of like traditions and things like that, that like maybe you don't know, or that you don't understand, or that maybe don't make sense. And so um being sort of curious, not in like a voyeuristic kind of way, but sort of like tell me, and like, I don't know what that is. And that again, that doesn't mean something bad about me, right? That doesn't mean that I'm somehow um not informed, or not dedicated. No, it's just that's something that's different. um and I think that the real like powers, and specifically now, I think like in light of like what we're living in now, is how isolated people are feeling, and sort of the power of being seen, and being seen that like I'm working with a young person that comes from a different background as me, or a different SES, right? And like, and I see that, and I see their experience. Like I see that this is sort of their world, and I want to know more about that. And that's not like taboo. And it's, there's something very powerful, because I think, the young person seeing the differences, right? So like I can avoid it, but they know what's going on, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
with how difficult I think it might be to engage with the young folks who are really struggling, and not, I mean, if as adults we don't know how to handle things, right? Like the young people are really struggling, right? And so sort of being able to remove that barrier, and it's like, yeah, I see you, like, and it like, and you, and your life and circumstance matters to me, right? So it's just, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right, because I think for a lot of us, we could create facades even in our relationships. Especially in mentoring relationships, you could use school or an after-school program. There are ways that you can mask certain things, right? And then all of a sudden, now we can't mask anything anymore. So, Maria, talk to me a little bit about in the absence of masking, right? You talked before about shame. I think that for a lot of young people, even knowing that as they hear about the disparities and that I am part of that conversation, I am the conversation, that does
Yeah.
something to a young person. Talk to me a little bit about, you know, what does that do to a young person from a mental, standpoint? And then more importantly, as adults, how do we help them navigate some of that?
Well, I think this is like a prime time for us to really be mindful of the fact that this is the point of internalization of a lot of things for young folks, right? Internalized shame, internalized racism. Like there's a lot of the internalized pieces that are really in flux right now, like in their psyche and their mind, and are starting to solidify themselves based on where they are, you know, in their own trajectory and in their age range and all that. And so it's important for us to be mindful of the fact that whatever it is that we are allowing to be and not disrupting is what's likely to stick. And they're then going to be the adults that are then going to have to be like us, unlearning all the time, right? Like, I have to now unlearn that I'm not worthy because of the color of my skin, right? Like, I now have to unlearn this and that about, you know, my being a woman in this society. Like, there's all these things that now, you know, we have to undo, that are ingrained in us because, you know, we didn't perhaps like have people around us that had the facility of being able to help us to navigate those things without it, you know, like becoming a solid part of who we are. And so just to understand that, because, you know, right now is a wonderful moment in prevention, for younger folks, rather than like the reactive stuff that we have to do as adults. Like, oh, now, you know, it's happened, and now, you know, like I kind of have these ways, they're established patterns of, you know, mental unwellness, and now I have to, you know, be so like intentional and dedicate so much time to undoing this. And so that's the thing, that's important there. But also shame, I think even as adults, like we don't really understand shame and what it is and what it does. Like, I think it's one of those emotions that we often even confuse with guilt. I feel guilty, I feel ashamed, and there's like always that, like, you know, and guilt is usually, it's about, you know, feeling bad that you did something that you're not proud of. It doesn't coincide with your values. And shame is like, I am a bad person. And how often do you hear kids say, am I bad, mommy? Like, I'm so bad, you know, bad boy, bad girl, like, you know, and there's these like black and white, good and bad ideas, about the self that become internalized and become, you know, the production or like the factory of shame. And so we have to really like get at that before it becomes, you know, this whole big thing that we have to undo. Right now, there's a lot of work that we can do to just educate kids about emotions so that they're aware, and they're aware of the language that they're using. Sometimes the language that they may even be internalizing, unfortunately, in their environment because of us, adults, right? And helping them to just increase their own consciousness and awareness, towards like their own mental wellness and mental health state. There's something that both Roshnee and I, you know, also like as being clinicians that have this like specific set of trainings, like we're also pretty aware of like things like body scanning and stuff like that. And I feel like stuff like that works really well for kids because it's like active stuff, you know, that you can do, and you can do it in fun ways. Or self-soothing can be done, you know, with kids in fun ways too. There's a lot of squishies that you can find at the dollar store, or if you don't have that, you know, like disposable right now because we kind of can't go out, like finding fuzzy stuff in the home, like fuzzy pillows, and you like kind of use that as self-soothing, or you know, other things that can like produce like, you know, tactile like stimulation and things like that that kids just love, you know, and they really gravitate to them. It's really grounding for them. So, you know, it's just about acknowledging the shame piece, acknowledging all the full, you know, the fullness of like what is likely to happen to this generation of kids in their future because of everything that's happening right now, and doing whatever preventative, you know, interventions we can right now to help them feel grounded.
Yeah, and I guess as I listen to you all speak, and we had this conversation before, and I guess this is what kind of surfaces for me in the work, you know, in our work with young people, we're always trying to listen. I think one of the best rules we have as mentors is to show up curious, right? To be authentic about what you know and what you don't know, which Roshnee mentioned, which when we're talking about this cultural humility is such a huge part of the equation, right? And knowing some of your biases walking in and how you define words and understanding that this relationship with this young person might completely transform the way you're thinking, and you have to be open for that opportunity. The other thing that I'm hearing, and I think this is why the self-care piece becomes so big, is that we have to take in some of what they need to say in order for them to be okay, right? We've got to listen, we've got to probe, we've got to ask, and then we've got to help them sort of determine how are they going to self-soothe, to your point, what brings them joy, what can help through that. And you've got to be ready to do something like that, because it's not going to be like, oh, let's walk in the park and it'll be fun. It's your stress on top of their stress, right? So I think it's really important that in this regimen that we're talking about, the self-care is important, the curiosity is important. And then, like you said, asking questions to help them define almost what those feelings are, right? Because a lot of times, if you would have asked me as a teenager what were my feelings, the spectrum of vocabulary around happy, sad, and mad was about it, right? But now you know that there's the blues, and the blues has all these spectrums to them, right? And so how do we help them sort of find that language? I think is really important. I think the other big thing for me that's been surfacing and I'm really worried about, and I talk about this often with my staff, and I'm curious about your thoughts on how we can have these conversations, because in New York City, in New York State, they're going to have to be had. And it's about grieving and loss, right? The hardest thing about this pandemic is you don't even experience the person sick sometimes, right? They go to the hospital and then all of a sudden there's no hospital visit, there's no anything. The person's now gone. In the loss, there's no social or religious ritual like we had before, where there's celebration of life and extended families that come in and sort of, if you bury someone, the wake or the memorial, all those things help you as a young person start to learn how to put words and arms around your feelings. So it is no surprise I hear program staff tell me often that young people seem to be walking around numb and saying things nonchalantly about loss. What are some things we can do in those conversations to have them start connecting to their feelings? Because it'll manifest in other ways, right? Because when you're not talking about them, you will act out and you'll do the risky behaviors. So what's some language, what's some ways that we can have some conversations about loss and grieving? Maybe some things we shouldn't do, I don't know, because it's always a hard conversation. Dr. Barrett, you want to take that one?
Sure. My reaction is, I think grief is hard for adults to wrap their head around.
Yeah.
And I say that and I'm adding and I think that that's okay, because I think it is this sort of complicated process. And so, I'm saying that, sort of so then imagine like a young person, just grief under normal circumstances, how complicated and I think hard it is for young folks to understand. And then adding this context, right, that again, it's like adults trying to make sense of this. So I think there's something to sort of asking the question are you okay, how are you handling this, and sort of anticipating a clear response, I think is not a way to start, because the response might be I don't know, what do you mean? Might be
Yeah.
a response like, what do you mean, you know, like so and so's gone, like what, you know, or I guess I'm fine, you know. I think even like a sort of confusion around that. So I do think that there's something to sort of thinking about, that young people will need some sort of help in like what that even means. Like this idea of like, I'm checking in with you to see how you're feeling about this. Might not, and not because like not like them not being smart, right? Like this is not like an intellectual thing. I think it's more of like an emotional piece of like, I don't know how to make sense of this. You know, and I think in terms of like, so what can I do about that, right? So there's something about like explaining like that grief is this complicated process that doesn't necessarily make sense, but it occurs, and acknowledging like it's more challenging in like the current circumstances. And so basically like you might feel a bunch of things, or you might feel numb, and that might not make sense, but I'm here, right? So there's sort of like this being available, but you know, sort of I think explaining like it doesn't work like this, right? So it's not like I'm sad and then I'm better. Like that's not how it works. That's not how it works under normal circumstances, and it's not going to happen now because there is no closure, there is no moment, there is no, and we don't even know like when, even if families do want to have some sort of ceremony, like we don't know when that's going to be, right? So there's
Right.
not even being able to anticipate, have this open wound now, but like in 2 months we're going to be able to get together and really honor this person. Like, you know, that might not be the case. So there is something with like tolerating sort of that like gray sort of like, you don't know how you feel, and that's okay, but I'm here, and it's just sort of like, but I'm present. And like I said, I think a little bit of education around, you know, it's not linear, like things don't always make sense. And that's okay, and I'm still here, right? Like, so it's like that kind of messaging, like I'm still here, and like I care about you, and like I want to be here in some way. Like you don't have to figure out how I'm going to help you, right? But like I'm going to be present. And doing that, I think also checking in with ourselves, right? Because again, I think like adults are not sort of in this other place, like we're going through this as well, right? So yeah, it's just it's really complicated now.
And I
I think the process, yeah.
And I think it seems oversimplistic, but people sometimes think they're telling young people, I'm here for you. They assume young people know that, but what you're saying is you have to outright say, like, this is confusing. You're supposed to be all over the place. I am here, and it's okay to be that, because
like
we do have to be that.
Yeah, like explicit. Yeah, like I'm here. I'm asking you, you know, how you're feeling, like that, you know, that's okay that, you know, you're not quite sure, or that you're feeling a bunch of things, and that's okay, right? Because I'm here. I think the one thing that I think in my work, what people often report is, which is one of my, you know, I always have this reaction to like, in our effort to want to make people that mean something to us, no one likes to see those people in pain, right? We don't want to see our loved ones or young folks that we're working with, we don't want to see them in pain. And there can be sometimes an inclination of like, this is going to be okay, right? Like we just have to move forward. This, right? Like move on kind of language, that I always have sort of like a, don't say that. Don't say that. Don't say that to people, because it's coming from it's usually coming from like a good place, which is like, I want you to get better and feel better. But that shuts the door. That shuts the door from like, so that means I can't tell you that I'm not okay, and you're available for me when I'm okay. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like just doing this, like just I'm here, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think putting some words to those emotions and giving permission for, especially adolescents, to cry. Like, to say, that if you want to cry, if you just want to sit here and cry, you can do that with me. Even if it doesn't happen right away, I think sometimes we have to give people permission to feel, because most of the time we're told we can't feel those things, or cut it out, or stop crying, or move on. That's a big part of our culture, right? Especially when you are sort of fortunate, because things could be so much worse, right? So you suck it up even more. That's part of the resilience, right? That we think that kids have. But Dr. Walker, tell me a little bit about what's the language? What should we be saying to kids? If you had to give a mentor, three or four things that they say, what do they say? Because it's real, right? Their friends are losing their friends. We're losing
Mhm.
teachers, principals, parents, grandparents, extended family, immediate family, multiple members of families, right? It's almost
Mhm.
unimaginable what some young people are going through.
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with modeling, right? Like, I am sad too, right? There's so much power in that, and being able to say, like, I'm experiencing this, and to allow them to understand that it's a natural response, um, and also that it is a response, right? Because there can be just a feeling, and not them not actually knowing, oh, this is sadness. And so just
Right.
saying that, right, I think can be really, really helpful. Um, also, like, being able to state um, the experience of uncertainty. Like, I really don't know what's going to happen in the future. And, we all have to practice healthy distress tolerance around this time right now, and how uncertain it is for all of us. Um, to Roshni's point, the whole thing, like, it's going to be okay, and to be honest, we don't really know what it's going to be. We're just like,
Right.
playing the game, and so let's allow them to, we have to establish safety for them. We know kids need a sense of safety. And they also, a powerful lesson in being a human in this world is also understanding there are things that are uncertain, and you can survive that uncertainty. Um, you can, like, actually, like, feel your emotions through that uncertainty. And so there's that. Then the safe piece, I think, is really critical. Whatever it is that, flows from the heart that can help the child experience safety, or like someone is there for them, and that is a safety hub, where they can come to, um, that person, whether it be the mentor, or be like, other people within that child's life. Um, just knowing that there is a safe place to go to, just to be. The child could literally, like, sit crisscross applesauce on the floor, and just be. Or they can talk, or they can play, or whatever, whatever, cry, whatever, but just be.
Yeah.
Um, and Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, really critical. And really just elaborating that no matter what happens, that, um, like, I mean, I don't know if the mentorship model allows for there being continuation of a relationship, um, however long that relationship might be, but just know that, I'll be with you, and some
Yeah.
of these things that are at a standstill, we'll work through them, so that there is a very loose plan in place, right? Like, not that, we'll get you back on track with your grades, we know that you're, like, kind of falling behind, and, like, we'll get you back on track. You really don't know that, but, you can help them to understand that you'll be a part of that process of reintegrating back into the new normal of society and the new normal of school and all the new normals that they'll have to contemplate with.
I think that's right. I think young people are testing us all over again to see if we're really going to stick around in this new reality, right? You stuck around in the old reality. Now with this virtual thing, are you really going to ride this out? And I think that's an important part of us staying consistent and being, good listeners in the process so that they can share their feelings. Um,
I did
one of
have
the
a thought.
things as we were, yeah, go ahead.
I just had a thought on something that Dr. Buqué mentioned in terms of the modeling, which I think some people struggle with because I think, right, if we're, as adults, I think there's a sense of like, yeah, I want to make sure that this young person feels safe. So like, I'm going to be strong, right? And so this idea of, I'm sad too, I think can potentially challenge like, well, what does that sort of do to the dynamic? Am I still going to be seen as like this strong, reliable figure, right? And I guess the answer is yes, right? Like that there is real strength and being able, and that's the strength of modeling, right? It's like I can acknowledge that I feel sad. I can acknowledge that I'm confused. Like I can acknowledge like, yeah, I can acknowledge these feelings and right. And there's something about like, and I could put it into words, right? And it's safe to put this into words and it's safe for me to tell someone, right? And like, and you can use similar words back to me and like, that's okay, right? So that in some ways there is such strength in that. So, the need to maybe minimize our own vulnerability because somehow then will I be seen as effective, right? Will this person start to worry about me? And it's like, no, there's real power and there's real strength and there's a real gift to give a young person by being able to model vulnerability is okay and it doesn't sort of like take away from you. It like, if anything, it helps to ultimately build you, right? So
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean I just wanted to sort of say that because
No, I think
you
that's
know,
absolutely
I
right.
love
I
that.
think the danger in that is that you're not in a therapy session with the young person. You have had to have your own sort of outlets, and what you're sharing with that young person is sort of the camaraderie that comes with the fact that we have a shared experience, right? So within that, there has to be some boundaries because I do know that people are like, oh, that's my friend too. And for young people, you gotta be a little careful, right? You have to have some
Right.
boundaries and share and model and mirror to the extent that it'll help them share and model and mirror. We can't lose sight of that part,
yeah.
Yeah.
So
right?
You don't
yes,
want
so
So
to
sorry.
yeah,
destabilize.
Yeah. So yes,
yeah,
they're not our therapists, right? But again,
Right.
it's sort of like once, and again, this goes back to what we said earlier, right? It's like, have I checked in with myself, right? And sort of like done what I need to do, and then it's like no, so now it's a teaching moment as opposed to
Hmm.
like yeah, like you're sorting this
yeah.
out for me. Yeah, that's an undue responsibility on the young person. Yeah.
No, and I think it's hard sometimes because if we're all navigating these emotions, it's very easy to get caught up in the back and forth of it, right? But you still have to be sort of the adults in the room and be able to manage that piece. And it can be hard, there is no real rule book right now for what is happening and how young people are navigating. But I do want to, we've got about 10 more minutes. And so what I did want to do was open it up for the questions section to see what people are asking. Thank you so much for your knowledge. I know that, you're trying your best not to give too rigid advice as therapists along the way. So I know how challenging that can be, so that you maintain some balance here. But I think that sometimes it's reassuring to know that it is not rocket science. It's about being in touch and in tune and then doing the simple things, right, which I think are really critical. So I'm gonna ask my team, Jessica or Hadley, to jump on and maybe share the questions that are coming in. Hi, Hadley.
Hi everyone. Oh,
Bye.
sorry, I had two screens going. We've gotten some great questions from everyone who's participating. So the first one we'll get to is from Eric. So Eric is asking, how do Black and Brown communities deal with global pandemic when there has been a systemic pandemic that has plagued the communities for years already? And so he says disease, finances, housing, law enforcement, and so on.
Yeah, and it's been only exasperated by the global pandemic, right? It's not that those realities aren't going away. They're almost doubling down culturally for us as a country in so many ways. I do think from my perspective, as we're talking to young people, we have to be honest about having those conversations and what that means because they're experiencing it and they're also internalizing it. So I do think that one of the things we have to do is have open conversations. And if you can't be the person having them, then maybe your program could start facilitating some discussions around their experiences with microaggressions and their realities of what they're facing, because it's become, now it's not just, hidden under the rug anymore. It's front and center. What do you all think, Dr. Buqué and Dr. Barrett?
Well, the thing, is that it's just the same as with very many other things that are happening. A lot of the systemic inequities that were noted, and also just other crises that happen at a global scale. Communities of color are yet again being impacted, disproportionately so, at remarkably higher levels than everyone else, right? So we have to think about the compounded trauma and the compounded grief that is existing in our communities as being so much more. That's one piece, and there is this like double-edged sword of the resilience piece that I want to talk about, right? Like on one end, it's really unfair to hold communities of color, to this high standard of resilience. However, we have exhibited such, in all of these areas of systemic inequities and ongoing crises and ongoing just health-related crises as well, because we have been plagued, by way of exploitation, with many other crises that have been health-related within our communities. And so there is, so much to learn from how we have been able to survive and thrive in the past, and at the same time allow for there to be a very explicit and very authentic expression of vulnerability that is really there because we are hit on so many levels. We are so much more vulnerable right now. So it's a matter of understanding that the vulnerability is going to be really, really profound. And the likelihood of the amount of recovery is probably going to have to be much more intentional for our communities.
Yeah, and that means that as things go back to that normalcy, being able to identify those patterns in young people that are triggers and signs that they themselves are trying to manage their trauma. And we've got to become hyper aware of that and be trauma informed on how to be responsive to it, right? What other questions, Hadley?
So Abigail asked, so they're working with a lot of young people who aren't able to connect right now. So that's a very widespread problem that a lot are facing. And she's wondering if there are tips for doing this, starting these types of conversations over social media or other virtual mechanisms.
So What I'll say is from a program perspective, because there are some concerns around safety and liability that one would have to be careful of around having sort of these free platforms like Facebook or Instagram where young people are, because you don't want to encourage them to create profiles in those platforms to be able to tune in with you. But you can utilize those platforms if they're already on those platforms, which means they have some type of parent oversight. You're not encouraging them to come into free open spaces. And then you utilize the fact that they're on that space and create your own sort of, social media page where maybe you're engaging in those open forums and they can join. And with a lot of them, you can use closed forums and have private sort of groupings. But I would say that they would have to be on the platform first as a safety precaution for you and the program, and then have those guided discussions to the extent you can. But yeah, when there are connectivity problems, we got to find the young people where they are. So wherever they are, try to figure it out and host it there.
And then are there any tips for how these conversations might be had over those mediums? How to be vulnerable when it's virtual?
Any thoughts, doctors, on how to be vulnerable when it's virtual?
Yeah. So right now, as mental health professionals, we're all working in the virtual world, right? And I think the first step for us, and this is sort of what I would share, right, is that like this is the way. Like there is no alternative, right? And so, and again, I think there's parts of like what platforms and like what sort of protocols are in place, so I don't want to, I feel a little hesitant to speak too specific, but I do think that this is the platform that they're using, right? And I think in some ways, young people are more comfortable with sort of more virtual spaces than the adults. At least that's been my observation. So in some ways, it's sort of like overcoming the adults' sort of discomfort, because yeah, like I said, I think younger folks are having it's that might be sort of a little bit safer for them. So, but again, not knowing exactly like the exact platforms, I'm feeling a little bit at a loss. But I think in some ways the same conversations that can be had face to face, like can be had in other ways. I think if we overcome like our own like discomfort with that.
Yeah, you've got to show up with your own authenticity and be able to open it up. And what you do have to do to encourage engagement is figure out what makes it tick for the young person in that conversation. So making sure that some of those conversations might be youth led, or that you're bringing together young people to celebrate in memoriam people they've lost, that allows for them to talk about the person they loved in a safe space, and then maybe talk about emotions. So it's figuring out how to weave those things in a way that's desirable for them to show up authentically and to show up and not be ashamed of what they're going to share, and then be able to share it.
So we are running out of time and we have a lot more questions. So we'll take another few, but I just wanted to let everyone know that we will follow up with you in email if we don't get to answer your question. So I'll ask another and this is from Allie. So if we're worried about a student and think they could benefit from counseling, how involved should the mentors get in recommending counseling? Should they be following up about it? Or should they be respecting the mentee's boundaries if they don't follow up on the recommendation?
You guys could take the clinical approach, and then I'll talk about, all the other things they have to be careful of. But in general, when somebody says you should go to counseling and they don't want to, or they're resisting, what does that look like?
For a child, the general channels usually have to go through the parent. So it's an important dialogue to have with the parent if someone suspects that a child could benefit from counseling as a source of support. So it's a matter of utilizing, the support and bolstering of the parental relationship, to be able to, or caregiver relationship to be able to facilitate that connection to counseling. It is especially hard right now to secure relationships with counselors given the space that we're in. However, there are also, other means and methods out there that have surfaced recently. I won't name any, but there are some, and I guess if anybody has any, curiosity, we can always send links. But there are some that are available via text, or through the phone in ways that some of this generation is more comfortable with talking. That can also help the kid buy into the idea of counseling. So it's a matter of connecting with the parent about it, seeing about availability, and then, utilizing a format that the kid might be comfortable with as well.
Yeah, and I think if you guys could share with us some of those resources, we'll be happy to post them on our website. And I think that for programs, mentors, relying on your programs to figure out how maybe they can partner with someone that can give a sort of larger scale support to the entire mentee population you serve would be very good too. Hadley, any other questions? Do we want to try one more before we jump off? I know that people are jumping off, but we have 150 people still engaged, so.
Yeah, we can ask another one. So let me just find. So someone asked.
We'll answer.
So we have the question: what should the conversation look like in September? So I imagine this is in relation to young people and school.
Yeah, so reopening is going to be a huge thing, right? I would imagine the fear and the anxieties are going to be high. And I think that what my advice would be this, and then you guys can jump in. I think the fact that we haven't been able to provide support and services to young people through this mental health sort of transition that they've had, when things start to get normalized, a lot of it is going to show up, and it's going to show up in different behaviors, right? And it's going to be up to us to really stop and understand that there's not a bad kid in the room. There's stuff going on, and we have an obligation to take care of it. And then that's where Dr. Vaca and Dr. Barrett, are going to be super needed, right? Those are the people who swoop in and bring in, because it's going to be, at that point, it's going to be at high octane. So it's going to be a lot. That's sort of my theory going into September. And the more conversation you have of the reopening and how they manage some of that is going to be critical.
Yeah, that's my sense. I think, in some ways it's sort of, I don't think anyone even is going to know what September might look like, but I think to honestly be prepared that there's going to be a response. And, the response might be like acting out, sort of these acting out behaviors that we usually label as, sort of getting into trouble kind of behaviors, but also like withdrawing, right? So like the silent kid is not necessarily okay, right? So, yeah, I think there is going to have to be kind of like a readiness for like that's going to happen, and I think some game plan in terms of like, just thinking about like this counseling question that we had, like what kinds of like resources may need to be compiled to like help, because I also think like the schools are going to be having their own reaction, right? I mean, so it's sort of like, again, like it's going to be like the kids are coming into the new normal and thinking like, what is normal now? And like teachers are sort of going to also not know what new normal is, right? Or principals. So.
Yeah. I think it's going to be incumbent of this movement, the mentoring movement, to be paying attention a little differently. and being able to start sourcing resources. I really think that. We are over our time. I want to thank the 137 people that are still hanging on strong. I hope that you guys enjoyed this format and really appreciate it. We have a link. If you take your cell phone and put it up to this little barcode, it takes you straight to a 2-minute survey about how this was, how this format was. For us, your feedback is essential. We tried something new. I brought different players to the game. So we'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you so much, Dr. Vasquez, Barrett, Dr. Buqué. You make me so happy because I know that I'm worried about a lot of things often and drive Hadley and my staff crazy about it. But I know that there are people out there like yourself who are well versed in it and really there to help the community and support us in having those difficult conversations. So thank you for your time today. Appreciate it. Thank you all for spending the afternoon with us. Have a good one. Take care. Are